Hi, welcome back to my YouTube channel. So this is under horrific oppression and considerable bullying by my TikTok crew and several others. I have now finally decided, under much considerable pressure, to put together my YouTube creditation of the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire. So I'm going to get straight to it. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, in terms of geopolitical, perhaps the most seminal event of the Middle Ages, was the successful Ottoman siege of Constantinople in 1453. The city had been an imperial capital as far back as the 4th century, when Constantine the Great shifted the power centre of the Roman Empire there, effectively establishing two almost equally powerful halves of an antiquated greater empire. Constantinople would continue to serve as the capital of the Byzantium Empire even after the western half of the Roman Empire collapsed in the late 5th century. Naturally, the Ottoman Empire would also use Constantinople as the capital of its empire after their conquest effectively ended the Byzantine Empire, and thanks to the strategic location, it had been a trading centre for years and remained one today until the Turkish name under the Turkish name of Istanbul. The end of the Byzantine Empire had a profound effect not only on the Middle East but Europe as well. Constantinople had played a critical part in the Crusades, and the fall of Byzantium meant that the Ottomans now shared a border with Europe. The Islamic Empire was viewed as a threat by the predominantly Christian continent to the west, and it took little time for the different European nations to start clashing with the powerful Turks. In fact, the Ottoman would clash with Russians, Austrians, Venetians, Poles, and more before collapsing as a result of World War I, when they were part of the Central Powers. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople also played a decisive role in the fostering the Renaissance in the Western Europe. The Byzantine Empire's influence had helped ensure that it was the custodian of various ancient texts, most notably from the ancient Greeks, and when Constantinople fell, Byzantine refugees flocked west to seek refuge in Europe. Those refugees brought books that helped spark an interest in the antiquate that fueled the Italian Renaissance and especially put an end to the Middle Ages altogether. The long agonized of the sick man of Europe, an expression used by the Tsar of Russia to depict the fallen Ottomans, could almost blind people to its incredible power and history, preserving its mixed heritage coming from both its geographical position, rising above the ashes of the Byzantine Empire, and the traditional inheritance from the Muslim conquests. The Ottoman Empire lasted more than 6 centuries. There's a bit of a misconception, in my opinion, on how long it lasted. The Ottoman Empire could easily be argued from Rum, which means I would have said 7 centuries, but we're agreeing to disagree. It solidly fought, died and conquered lands on 3 different continents, making it one of the few stable multi-ethnic empires in history, and likely one of the last. Thus, it's somewhat inevitably that the history of its dissolution is at the heart of a complex geopolitical dispute, as well as the sectarian tensions that are still key to understanding the Middle East, North Africa, and the Baltics. When studying the fall of the Ottoman Empire, historians have argued over the breaking point that it saw a leading global power slowly become a decaying empire. The failed Battle of Vienna in 1683 is certainly an important turning point for the expanding empire. This is when they started looking inward, when the Ottomans stopped expanding, stopped attacking, stopped growing, stopped critically moving forward, and started to reflect more on inward. And any empire that looks inwardly, like we can take Donald Trump as an example in the West today, is on the decline, relatively speaking, on imperial power. Important turning point for the expanding empire. The defeat of the Grand Vizier Karl Mustafa Pasha at the hands of a coalition led by the Austrian Habsburg dynasty. Holy Roman Empire and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth marked the end of the Ottoman expansionism. It was also the beginning of the slow decline during which the Ottoman Empire suffered multiple military defeats, found itself mired by corruption, and had to deal with the increasingly mutinous Janissaries, the empire's initial foot soldiers. Now, the mutinies of the Janissaries was a lot to do with much of Muslim history in general, where the eunuchs, who were generally political class, would then fight the elite infantry that weren't genuinely Muslim to start with. Janissaries were generally recruited from Christian boys, who then later on became Muslim afterwards. Despite it all, the Ottoman Empire would survive for over 200 more years, and in the last century of its life it strove to reform its military, administration and economics until it was finally dissolved. Years before the final collapse of the empire, the Tazimat, or reorganisation, a period of swift reforms, led to a significant change in the country's military apparatus. Among others, which certainly explains its initial success, the Ottoman Empire was able to achieve against its rivals. Similarly, drafting of the new constitution, Canos Isabald Basic Law, in 1876, despite it being shot down by Sultan Abdul Hamid II just 2 years later, as well as its revived by the Young Turks movement in 1908, highlighted the understanding among Ottoman elites that change was needed and the belief that such change was possible. Looking at the events of the empire's last 2 centuries and interpreting the fall of the Ottoman Empire as a slow but long decline is what could be called an acceptable narrative. This is a difficult part to critically hold, but I agree with that. At the start of World War I, the Ottoman Empire was officially described as the dwindling power mired by administration corruption. This was well noted. Using inferior technology, again this was noted that the technological advantage had been lost a century beforehand, and plagued by poor leadership. That I disagree with. The Ottoman Empire still had pretty good leadership at its time period, but it had issues with much more internal. There was a lot of internal fighting. The general idea is that the Ottoman Empire was lagging behind, likely coming from the clear stagnation of the empire between 1683 and 1826. Yet it can be argued that this portrayed is often misleading and fails to give a full picture of the state of the Ottoman Empire. That part I agree with. The fact that the other existing multicultural empires, namely the Austro-Hungarian Empire, also did not survive World War I, should put into question that this accepted narrative. Looking at the reform technology, advances, and modernisation effects made by the Ottoman elite between 1826 and the beginning of World War I, one could really wonder why such a thirst for change failed to save the Ottomans, while similar measures taken by other nations such as Japan during the Meiji era did in fact result in the rise of a global power in the 20th century. Because the Meiji weren't as ethically diverse as the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had several ethno and religious groups amongst them, so the reforms would have to benefit all parties for it to have been successful, where the Japanese reforms, on the other hand, only required to deal with the Shinto, with critically some Christian, Islam and Buddhism religious, but they were all ethno-Shinto people. During the procedure of its collapse, the Ottoman Empire was at the heart of a growing rivalry between two of the competing global powers at the time, England and France. The two powers asserted their influence over a declining empire, the history of which is anchored in Europe as much as it is in Asia. However, whilst the two powers were instrumental in their final defeat and collapse of the Ottoman Empire, their stances towards what came to be known as the Eastern Question, the fate of the Ottoman Empire, is not one of clear enmity. Both England and France found at times reasons to extend the life of the sick man of Europe until it finally sided with their shared enemies. Russia's stance towards the Ottoman Empire is much more clear-cut. The rising Asia and European powers saw the Ottomans as a rival which they strove to contain, divide and finally destroy for more than 300 years in a series of wars against their old adversary. So this is both true and incorrect. England wasn't really a massive enemy of the Ottomans at the time period that we're mentioning here until World War I. The British Empire was less interested until the discovery of oil, which is then led towards the Arab uprising. This is the English understanding of why. I'm not critiquing why the Arabs did revolt against the empire. Oil was the reason that the English got involved. For the French, it was a measure of securing their beachheads and various landings in that area during the historical period. So both the French and English had different motives towards much of their actual invasions, destructions, and much of their actions going on for those 300 years. But critically speaking, this is the beginning of the description of the history of the empire. And I hope you've enjoyed my first 10 minutes. I will do another one today, and I will leave that as the 20 minutes for my first episodes until tomorrow. Alhamdulillah.